In the last few months, I've been having a lot of conversations, trying to work through a series of questions that I've been having around race and class, but also broader issues and getting to grips with where the left is at the moment. And some people have been really helpful to me in terms of resolving those questions or thinking through those questions. And I thought, given that I've learned so much from these conversations, I should open those out and try to begin to create a space within the left where we can have these conversations in a sort of relaxed environment, an interactive environment, so that we so that we can also build that kind of space. And in essence, what I'm sort of looking to do here is to create an environment for my generation, but also cross-generationally to work through some of the changes that we've seen or transformations that we've seen, both in political organizing, but also in the broader structures within which we organize over the last few decades. And then also trying to create a space in which we can learn about, think through the Black radical tradition as it relates to these analyses. And then finally, what we want to do is also provide context for debates that people might be seeing, raging on Twitter or on social media, but maybe don't understand the sort of history or the background to it. So providing that context in order for us to be able to understand our struggles, both locally, situate our struggles locally, internationally, and also historically. And so all the guests that I'll be inviting are people I've encountered, people I've reached out to, people who've reached out to me, who've helped me make sense of what's going on. And what I really want to do here is just share my love of radical politics, my love of the Black radical tradition, and through the people who sort of helped me learn it, expand my knowledge of it, etc. And so what we're going to do to start with, I'm not going to abuse the chair too much at this point. But what we're going to do is give both Mohammed and Chardine an opportunity. So there are two guests to give their introductory comments, and then I've got a series of questions that I hope will be able to spark a conversation. So I'm going to start with Mohammed, and I'm going to give you the sort of background when I introduce everybody. So I reached out to Mohammed after seeing a few of his posts on Facebook, and those of you who know me will know that I very rarely go on Facebook, but I reached out to Mohammed hoping to be able to start a conversation. It turns out he'd been meaning to reach out to me as well, and we ended up having a couple of Zoom calls, and really I found that experience really sort of instructive. I learned so much. He has a column with JSTOR Daily on Black radicals, where he sort of excavates and sort of makes accessible some of this tradition. And he's also a PhD student at Cambridge, who is reading around the Black radical tradition in sociology. Okay, so Mohammed, you go.
Yeah, thank you everyone for attending. I'm sorry I'm a little bit sleep deprived, so please forgive me for if I'm like a bit dazed. I think what I'd like to talk about just today is that there's this tendency for people to assume that as time moves by, ideas or thoughts are also progressing. As time moves by, our ideas are going to be moving towards perfection. Sometimes that doesn't happen in the history of Black thought, and sometimes, in fact, we regress and we go back in time. And so what I'm asking is just that for the present day generation to not necessarily condemn, so don't be so quick to condemn our elders and the people before us and their ways of thinking. And that's especially true on the question of political Blackness. I'm personally someone who doubts that political Blackness can come back in the way that it existed in the past. But I still think that we really have to grasp like what the importance of it was. And I also want to propose the idea that this false dichotomy between political Blackness and real Blackness doesn't exist. And actually all forms of Blackness are political. And I hope to like show that through some of the historical examples I'm going to be giving when I talk later.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. Okay, and then next I'm going to give the floor to Chardine. So I met Chardine a few months ago. It feels like we've known each other forever, but in essence, Chardine reached out to me on Twitter, and then we found out that we had quite a lot in common. We went for dinner, and the rest has been history. But essentially, Chardine represents a sort of tradition that I feel has been lacking or has been absent in a lot of the conversations, and she's been a person who's been pushing very importantly a particular sort of UK analysis of anti-racist struggle, and has been sort of a vocal voice for a politics of solidarity. And so I'll give Chardine the opportunity to open with her introductory comments.
Thanks, Annie. I was actually kind of stalking you from afar, so I'm glad. But I mean, I think this is important because I think, you know, the kind of sort of isolation that can sort of happen if you're a Black socialist at the moment, reaching out to people was really important for me. And I think it's definitely, I think we're in quite an exciting time now in terms of people starting to find each other and to start to kind of push back against this sort of overwhelming kind of liberalism that we're sort of facing in Black politics right now. But I mean, I think the thing for me is sort of just taking on from what Mohammed said as well, as being a very practical person who's quite involved in activism on the ground, and in sort of seeing this sort of schism between what people are talking about and what actually needs to be done. And what needs to be done is that we do need to be thinking about, you know, solidarity across race and across class, and how we can actually start to, you know, look back at that Black radical tradition that we had here and actually learn some lessons. And I'm always constantly saying, you know, what have we achieved so far in the last 5 years of this kind of neoliberal Black politics, like actual like concrete stuff? And there hasn't really been anything. There's been a lot of talk, there's been a lot of hashtags, but, you know, where is our legislation? Where are our structural changes? We haven't actually even, we haven't built upon what was done before. So yeah, like was said before as well, you know, we're so quick to sort of throw away the kind of lessons from our elders, but we're not actually really creating anything new or better to build for the next generation to build on. So I think that's something that I want to reflect on in these conversations and going forward.
Thanks so much. So essentially what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to launch straight into some of the questions that I've sort of prepared for the conversation. I've been talking to both of you quite a lot recently, and just emerging from that, I've had a few thoughts that I thought we should explore. So I'm going to start with, and at this point, just jump in at any point that you have a contribution. But to start with, I wrote a piece a while ago. I don't think it hasn't come out yet, actually, which started with an example of an interview just after we saw the explosion, just after the murder of George Floyd. We see an explosion of Black organising, and there was a Newsnight segment with Emily Maitlis and George the Poet. And at a point she says, you know, isn't this, and this is something which is typical of the British establishment, she's like, isn't it just different here? Isn't racism less bad here? And that's not really what I want to reflect on. What I want to reflect on is his response, where he sort of says, you know, it's just as bad here if you see deaths in police custody, if you see deaths in police custody, if you see the use of police brutality against Black populations in the UK. And what I found was quite lacking in that response was any kind of particular examples in the UK. And I think one of the issues that we face, I guess, as morbid as it is that when we sort of fight or discuss on the terrain of things like deaths in custody, which we don't have sort of figures which are as shocking as the state's figures, what's also raised are the other elements. So I was confused as to why he didn't raise stop and search. I was confused as to why he didn't raise the fact that the Tories were using the pandemic as an opportunity to attack migrant rights again. I was confused as to why, you know, he didn't have a discussion about attainment gap. He didn't have a discussion about the impact of austerity on particularly Black communities who tend to be overrepresented in working class communities. So I just wanted to reflect on sort of two things there with both of you. Firstly, the importation, in a sense, of a particular American analysis of racism, which centers on anti-Blackness, and then also to an extent what anti-racism needs to look like in Britain today, which I know is a massive question, but just beginning to flesh out some of the contours of racism as it manifests itself in the British context.
I mean, for me, I hadn't seen that Newsnight episode, so I'm definitely going to look it up. But I think what concerns me about that is this erasure of the problems that we have here, so then we don't actually come up with solutions of how to deal with them. So, you know, it's like that's automatically, and it's important for us to talk about George Floyd. I don't want us to be like, that's, you know, because there are crossovers that we need to look at, and that's about building solidarity across the Atlantic with those struggles and learning from each other. That's important. But it's also things like, you know, when we start erasing people like Jean-Charles Menzies because they are not what we determine to be black, or we ignore prevent because, you know, disproportionately that tends to affect people who are South Asian descent. So things like that, which are our experiences here of racism from this government, or from both Labour and the Tory governments. And we haven't developed a language to talk about it. And so we have all these platforms in this space. And so it's no wonder then that the presenter is coming up with a question or a comment saying, oh, well, racism here isn't as bad, because you haven't explained what it is that is bad here. So you don't provide any examples, and then you end up being picked apart, and people are going, well, you know, nothing, you know, we're not seeing, you know, people getting shot on the street by police. So we kind of end up creating this sort of, we end up creating that narrative ourselves, because we don't actually communicate what the issues actually are effectively. And so, you know, again, and I think it's quite interesting, not to, you know, say anything negative about George, but again, why are we getting these cultural commentators to be commenting about police brutality instead of people who are actually doing the work, like the monitoring group, or people who actually study those subjects? Why is it always, you know, someone who's done a podcast or something like that? So, you know, that's something that I'm looking to explore as well further down the line, this kind of replacement of the political activist with the sort of cultural commentator or communist or columnist who, you know, has a little bit of politics on the side, because I think there is a connection there between the popularity of Afro-pessimism and therefore anti-blackness and this kind of trajectory of the artist in that political space.
And I guess in response to, I mean, I've been reading quite recently for a piece that I've just written around this sort of history of Blackness as political, which is something I want to dive into a bit more later on. And just thinking about how we've sort of shifted from a moment in which culture was entirely subordinated to the question of politics into a sort of moment in which culture is treated both as separate from politics and driving politics. And just thinking about how the role of the artist has been completely dislocated from their role within the movement, and the critique of the artist, which is separate, which like you even find in Fanon, right? So the critique of the native intellectual, and I guess that can be extended also to the sort of like culture production around negritude, etc., in which people are trying to construct an image of Blackness which is separate from the material conditions of Blackness. And I think a lot of that has been a consequence of displaced anxieties around how Blackness is changing and how the class constitution of Blackness is changing, particularly in the context in which the image of Blackness has sort of frog-leaped centuries of oppression experienced by Black people to becoming this sort of meme, which starts with, you know, the mythical, perfect, communitarian African society pre-colonization. Africa then completely disappears, and then it becomes the meme of the Black militant of the 20th century, power to the people, but like not really articulating what that means, moving into today, right? And so this sort of weird canon of Blackness, which people don't really engage with more than at a superficial level, has been like elevated as the like sort of sole example means of understanding Blackness. Which then, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say it's also easily commodified and easily consumed. And I think we don't actually discuss enough in our community, like how we actually consume our own culture and what that actually means. We act as though in some ways that we're separate from the society that we exist in, that we don't actually have some of the same values in terms of like, you know, Thatcherism and all that kind of stuff. That's something that somebody else is doing, rather than actually thinking about what we do on that. But I'll let Mohammed speak whilst I get a place.
Yeah, I mean, just on the question of like of blackness, we have these categories today, and we imagine that they always existed, that we were always black, and that we always understood ourselves as black. And it kind of intersects with the question of art as well, is because we have to understand blackness as something like many of the other ideas of communion that we have, people, whether that's religion or etc., but especially as something within the present modern moment in the modern world, right? And you know, Benedict Anderson has this concept of nationalism being this thing that people imagine, but it's only made possible at a certain stage of development when you have the proliferation of the printing press, you have things like telegraphs, you have things like you have all of these different kinds of technologies that allow people in different parts of a territory or space to imagine themselves as part of that nation. And the story of blackness is very similar in that sense. And artists in the beginning and cultural workers did have a huge role to play in making that story. And this is what I mean by blackness as having always been something that's political, right? These kinds of understandings of ourselves, pre-communal Africa, and then all you know, Black Power and nothing in between. I mean, all of this stuff is these are the stories that we imagine to tell ourselves. You know, the first understanding of the idea of people being black, we have to recognize that in different contexts across different colonies around the world, whether they were British or French colonies, they all had their own different racial pecking orders. And people who would today be considered black were within those different racial pecking orders, different categories. And that was even the case here in Britain. I mean, here in Britain, the old categories where you were a new Commonwealth, you were colored, you were West Indian, and then some people were Caribbean, and some people were Indian. And these were the normal, regular categories that people understood themselves. And you only start to see this phenomenon of we are all black across these cultural boundaries at around the beginning of the 20th century. One of the first people to explicate this idea was Jane Nardal, one of the Nardal sisters, who was part of that negritude scene. She hosted the salon that a lot of the negritude people came and talked in. She wrote an article in 1928 called Black Internationalism. And I just want to read just a few words from that article to kind of show, so we can historically situate what it means to be black, you know? I mean, to kind of show like what was, wait, I had the, I don't know where it went. Yeah, I mean, she was like this, she wrote this, she wrote, blacks of all origins, of different nationalities, mores and religions, vaguely feel that in spite of everything, they belong to one and the same race. Previously, the more assimilated blacks looked down arrogantly upon their colored brethren, believing themselves surely of a different species than they. On the other hand, certain blacks who had never left African soil to be led into slavery looked down upon as so many base swine those whom at the whim of whites had been enslaved, then free, then molded into the white man's image. And so there was this understanding that I'm West Indian, I'm different from the descendants of Africans who are from the continent. And that took a political project called Black to bring those different communities together under that one barrier. And these are things that we often forget in trying to situate things. Now, the role of the United States was huge in this time period. So it's not new that we take ideas from the United States. The Black Panther movement here in the US also took its ideas from the United States. So the United States has to also understand, and the Black community in the United States have to understand, that they have a very important role in the proliferation of ideas of blackness around the world. And when there are irresponsible ideas circulating in the United States, that also means that unfortunately and undoubtedly, whether that's here in Britain or maybe even in a place like South Africa, those kinds of ideas are going to proliferate there as well. And so these kinds of ethno-national, so if we're saying that blackness was always a political project, then what that means is that it's not necessarily that we're in a new post-political blackness era. It just means that the political nature of that blackness has changed. And what that means is, in what direction has it changed? And then we can start to understand that these new currents, like the American descendants of slavery current in the United States, which says that reparations should only be in the American descendants of slavery, we should limit immigration from the Caribbean countries and African countries. That is a kind of direction that's going on within the structure of current American capitalism, where things are becoming more and more insular, right? And Afro-pessimism also represents a kind of more insular understanding of Blackness, and that's being exported here. And when you try, and so in certain cases in the past, the exploitation of ideas from the Black radical tradition, Black radicals in the United States, was adapted and adopted to our circumstances, so that we can figure out ways of making sense of it in our own context. And that, for example, meant finding common cause with people of South Asian descent. Today, unfortunately, what's being imported instead is the same kind of insular politics that I would argue not only is it not applicable here, it's not applicable there either. So that's how I see all of this stuff playing out as well.
And I was just really struck by what you were saying when you I've never had the sort of question put that way of if Blackness is always a political project. In my head, that always means that Blackness has historically been tied to a radical project, right? Rather than the political project of Blackness has shifted from what it was in the 20th century to what it is today. And we have to sort of reckon with what that means, because it's doing a political work. So I'm just thinking about that in sort of alongside some of the things we've been talking about recently, Mohammed, around Blackness shifting from a radical political project which sees itself or situates itself as in opposition to forces of capital and imperialism, to a project which creates essentially what is ideology work of an abstract community in which the wealth of a few Black people is viewed as a collective wealth, and we cheer on the sort of exploitation of people of color, not only people on the African continent, but people on the South Asian continent, in the building of Black empires. So Beyonce's clothing empire, Kanye West's clothing empire, which is sort of built on the back of the exploitation of workers in garment industry. And I'm just thinking about the extent to which Blackness as the political project it is today is one which provides cover, in essence, for a massive reorganization of the way that we understand capitalism, and in a sense emerges as a form of capitalist realism in which we can only see our liberation in a world in which capital still exists, or in a world in which capitalism still exists, or imperialism still exists. And thinking about how that is sort of tied to a sort of rapid recession of our political horizons out of the international, out of the global, and into national borders, right? The shift from Black to African American coincides with a shift from anti-imperialist struggles to anti-racist struggles, the same way that the shift from Black British to the shift from Black to Black British, to African British, if that can exist, to Indian, Asian, British, Indian, all of those things coincide with a shift in our political horizons from the global into the national. And even as we're discussing or talking about the Black Lives Matter movement, there's a sort of veneer of transnationalism or internationalism, which is given by linking our analysis to what's happening in the States. But in reality, it's not really an internationalist politics, because the roots of co-organization, of coordinating struggles, of thinking through really how the technologies of capital manifest themselves and connect themselves between states isn't really being done. And thinking about that in relation to, for example, the complete refusal to see the connections between carcerality in the UK, in the US, and in Palestine.
Mm-hmm. And also the carcerality of working in a sweatshop in Bangladesh, for example, which is itself a type of imprisonment. And it was interesting to me to see how, as we know, there's like major sort of strikes happening in the textile industry. And we saw that also being reflected here in Leicester, where, you know, we found out about Boohoo and all that was going on. And you saw people talking about it, but it was almost like people kind of refused to kind of actually really start to see that in a kind of, you know, framework of sort of racial capitalism. I didn't see anybody talk about what was probably most likely either, you know, Latinx people or South Asian women working in those places, because it's Leicester. And there was no acknowledgement that at all. It's almost kind of like people have kind of pushed themselves into this corner where ethnically Black people are the bottom of the hierarchy, that they can't actually even get to the point of actually having any sort of empathy with anybody else who does not share their idea of what their racial heritage is. So I didn't see that is, you know, that in the UK, that is the sort of thing that we should be building our struggles around, those experiences of those people, not somebody who, you know, got mistaken for a security guard going into Vogue magazine. That's not where the point of the struggle is. Do you see what I mean? But I think, yeah, I mean, I'm actually really quite worried in terms of what we think we are going to achieve if we're not even going to be showing any kind of radical empathy to anybody other than wealthy people.
Well, I think this is another interesting sort of aspect of it, and just going back to that idea that I was pushing earlier about, you know, Blackness doing the ideology work of making us view the wealth of a few individuals as collective wealth, in the same way that like imperialism makes us view the wealth of the nation as like our wealth, rather than like something which is sort of accumulated by a tiny number of people, right? And just thinking about, you know, we don't have a language to describe some of these phenomena, even though they are representative of racial capital, or like racialized forms of capital, because the people who we immediately see as profiting from it are also South Asian, are also Black, are also, and so people sort of don't really see that. And I think tying that back to the articulation in the 60s, which said, you know, Blackness was a state of mind, in essence, and a relation to the structure of capital. So if you were a Black cop, those things don't mesh, right? If you were that says something about your relation, which then means you're no longer within our group, you're no longer within our community, right? And just thinking about how that element, there's been a sort of concerted effort to erase that element of the politics, which says Blackness is produced in the here and now and constantly reproduced. And it's reproduced through the exploitation of a section of people, and those people are the people with whom we have common cause. Rather, now we talk about Blackness as being, even if we don't talk about it as trans-historical, as being created in a particular moment, the transatlantic slave trade, and having been fossilized or ossified as like that hierarchy from then till now, and nothing has changed in race work since then, which just doesn't bear the weight of the evidence against it. But it seems to have been so normalized as the way that we understand race, but we essentially become blinkered or completely disarmed when, you know, we see racism and exploitation coming from people of color and Black people.
Absolutely. I mean, just like on this note of Blackness being formed at the transatlantic slave trade, you had this phenomenon in the 1930s, and I think this is really, really important to look into France again. I mean, I'm not just going to look in France, but look in France again. Because, you know, William Gardner Smith wrote a novel called The Stone Face. And in that novel, he was describing how, and this is something, I mean, you hear it in the story of James Baldwin, you hear it in a lot of people, where France becomes this place where Black people from the US escape to go to escape Jim Crow, right? They go to France and they're seen as they imagine it. But this is happening with so many different types of people, bricked up. You know, they're even starting their own clubs and establishments amid the oppression against Algerian people and the colonization of Algeria. But also, it's at the same time in which negritude becomes like the first idea of renunciating this idea of assimilated Frenchness, so that you can affirm your blackness, right? And it's all happening at the same time. The reason why this book by William Gardner Smith is so important is because it tells a story, a fictional story, of a character who's African American who goes to France and actually realizes that he's living in a fantasy world as a black person, and that the only way, and so one of the big, very important sentences is, when an Algerian comes up to him and asks him, what does it feel like to be a white man? Because to me, you're the white man, because we're the ones that are stuck in the colonized situation while you're living here. And so this guy, leaves the pale of the black intelligentsia and the jazz artists and all of that, and joins the Algerian struggle. And that's sort of the idea of it. And then that's an entirely that's the opposite kind of understanding of blackness and race, as being the commitment to the anti-colonial cause, than the type that we see in like some of Wilderson's new stuff about he has a conversation with the Palestinian and all of a sudden finds that he's somehow tapped into the collective unconscious of all Palestinian people to find that they're anti-black. I mean, these kinds of like understandings, what we're wrestling with is when it comes to the idea that Jay-Z and me are both slaves, is the problem with that kind of idea is, first of all, it gives cover to the black bourgeoisie. Second of all, throughout the history of the black radical tradition, there's always been a tussle between the black left and those who have, because this is not a new phenomenon of, that the black people are represented by their capitalists. It's something that, and this is also something that we need to get back to, is this culture of open debate. I mean, these were the terms in which W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington debated each other. These were the terms in which Marcus Garvey and W.B. Du Bois, or Marcus Garvey and George Padmore, publicly, passionately debated each other. It's not a rude conversation to have in front of the white people. It was, what's at stake is the stake of local black liberation is at stake. We need to understand, we need to have these debates openly and honestly. That was the idea back then, and there has always been this tussle. But what happened with the compromise of decolonization with the nation states, for example, with the compromise of integration in the United States, with the compromises of some of the civil rights measures that happened here, was that the black radical tradition kind of got subsumed by the system, unfortunately. And the black nationalist tradition took up the black nationalist, black capitalist stuff, took up the cultural ideas, language, and idioms of the black radical tradition, but kept it to very, capitalist politics. And so what we're having to deal with today is someone can feel that, you get this spectacle where Isabel dos Santos, child of the resistance in Angola, but now the richest billionaire in Africa, gets challenged for having billions of dollars funneled out of her African country, so she can live this lavish lifestyle and hang out with Paris Hilton, and then provides an intersectional feminist defense of her actions on BBC. Or you have this the spectacle of, for example, Beyonce doing the Black Panther thing, or just the ways in which you can look at a Ben and Jerry's statement about Black Lives Matter today, and it's indistinguishable from some of the mainstream statements of Black organizations today. And the reason why is because there's nothing there in that Black Lives Matter statement by Ben and Jerry's. It talks about white supremacy. It will talk about anti-Blackness, but it doesn't talk about capitalism. And that's the problem that we're dealing with today, right? If our language is indistinguishable from the corporations.
Absolutely.
And then just on this thing about Palestine, of all of your targets, amidst a strong rebellion, where just last year we saw a rebellion in the West Bank, at the same time in which Black people are rising up in Haiti, and then like months later, Black people are rising up in the United States and Britain, across the world. Why turn your energy and focus on the anti-Blackness of Palestinian people who are living under colonialism, of all of the people as well? I mean, this is where I have to say that, like, some of these ideas, you have to start to raise the question of, is this in the interests of the Black liberation movement, first of all, this anti-coalition politics? Second of all, like, is it fair to say that it's a bit suspicious, no? I mean, why can you spread these? Why are you spreading these ideas? It's just strange. And this stuff is becoming an orthodoxy, if for any sake than anything else. Let's shake up the orthodoxy so that we can engage in the kind of ruthless criticism that's necessary for our movement to move forward.
I'd like to, with Wilderson's thing about Palestine, actually, I want to ask you guys, so looking at that quote where he says, he's having a discussion with a, Palestinian friend, and his Palestinian friend says that there's more shame when they are searched by an Ethiopian Jew from the IDF. And then he reads that as they feel more shame because it's a black person that's searching them down. But I was thinking about this the other day, and I was like, the other way that could be interpreted as well is that there's a shame in that a person who themselves is being oppressed, exactly, within that state, and who should naturally be on your side in solidarity, is then, treating you in that way. And I wonder why Wilderson didn't, well, we know why, but that is another way that you could be looking at that. But it becomes, all Palestinians are anti-black, and therefore...
I mean, I just want to, just something really quick on that is that, I interpret it in the same way than you, but I think the most important thing is that, I can't have an interpersonal relationship with someone on the street, and I had a bad day, and I just make the generalization across history and make it seem like, that person and their people and everyone in your family and all of your ancestors hate me and my people and my ancestors. I mean, come on.
So, to abuse the chair, I got 3 things I wanted to say. Sorry about this. The first was to say that in that conversation, I had the same analysis of it as you guys. And in my mind, I was thinking, what would it be like to be, North Vietnamese, struggling against the United States, and it's black pilots in the fighter jets that are flying over you. People who should naturally have common cause with you because the promise of freedom, which these sort of Western countries are fighting under, doesn't even apply to you. You stand to gain nothing from it. Of course, it would be, more insulting, especially given, the history of, Palestinian contributions to Black liberation struggle, both domestically and internationally. Then also just thinking through what you were just saying about, sorry, my mind's gone blank. But just thinking through what you were just saying about how the conversation gets turned in on Palestinians and Palestinian anti-Blackness, and how in essence the Afro-Palestinian essentially just becomes a prop who gets pulled out whenever we want to talk about Palestinian anti-Blackness, but nobody's ever interested in any kind of vision or understanding of their liberation beyond that. So it's literally just a retort that gets used against people who want to find common cause with Palestinians, but their voices as people who are fighting against the oppression of the Israeli state are completely lost in that, right? Because even if you were to say that I situate myself on the side of Afro-Palestinians, or I find myself in common cause with Afro-Palestinians, that still would lead you to a position in which you would support, for example, BDS, right? And then the other thing I want to say is this just sort of framework of Afro-pessimism as being representative of a broader kind of analysis of race, class, gender, which takes the ideological realm as what we should analyze, not critique, in order to understand the way things work. And just thinking about the sort of linkage between the analysis of film and cultural output as a means of understanding the way society truly is, which sort of jars with, the historical examples that we have. And I'm always sort of a critic of the tendency to think of race and, gender and the way that it's sort of talked about in the sort of old class versus Marxist sense of being simply a sort of conspiratorial tool sewn by bosses in order to divide workers. But we do have historical examples like the Carnegie Report produced by the South African state prior to the implementation of apartheid, which was concerned with the question of poor whites becoming black because they were so poor, and therefore the need to make the poorest white richer than the richest black in order to maintain the racial order. Like, the state, the forces of capital have always been conscious of the fragility of racial order, have always been conscientious in making sure to establish policies which maintain that order. And for some reason, we seem to think of the post hoc justifications that they give for that order as being the way that things really are.
I mean, there's been a premature abandonment of what was a strong tenet of the Black radical tradition from the 60s and 70s, which is the idea of third world solidarity. Yeah. You know, there's a line in which, I mean, the reason why we don't want to get hard, because people always say, okay, why are you focusing on Afro-pessimism? It's not because Afro-pessimism, because we're engaged in some kind of academic debate, right? We're seeing these things spill over into the real world, and we're seeing the languages and ideas of these things get into the politics, even here, be like questions about funding, BLM UK, et cetera, Black communities, non-Black communities, et cetera, right? You know, and it's this kind of historical amnesia where you know, what I'm most concerned about is just protecting the Black radical tradition from being misinterpreted to mean its exact opposite. And I read somewhere where Wilderson says that we shit on the pronoun we, right? As Fanon said. If you actually read the African Revolution, Fanon talks of himself as an Algerian. He says we Algerian brothers. He actually says that. I mean, this is someone who spent his life, second part of his life, in Algeria. Come on. How are you gonna say that this is the principal theorist for your idea? You know? And I think that, like, the reason why it's really important is because the casual dismissal of the wisdom of previous generations comes from this idea that I guess they must have been confused. Maybe they didn't know how to think properly, right? And the thing that was strange about this is that when you look at the history of, I just want to read, for example, Malcolm X, right? Let's see if Malcolm X was someone who was you know, stupid or something, I guess, you know. He says, in Bandung, back, I think 1954 was the first unity meeting in centuries of Black people. This Bandung conference was organized, it was called the Afro-Asian Conference. It was organized by Indonesia, it was organized by that. Within Malcolm's category, sometimes he oscillates between the idea of calling them the dark race, Black race. You know, he says, for example, there were dark nations from Africa and Asia, some of them Buddhist, some of them Muslim, some of them Christian, some of them Confucianist, some were atheists. Despite their religious differences, they came together. Some were communist, some were socialist, some were capitalist. Despite their economic and political differences, they came together. All of them were black, brown, red, or yellow. The number one thing is they didn't let the white man attend, right? But he said, but they had unity. And then he said they were able to submerge their little petty differences and agree in one thing. That though one African came from Kenya and was being colonized by the Englishmen, and another African came from Congo and was being colonized by the Belgian, and another African came from Guinea and was being colonized by the French, and another from Angola and was colonized by the Portuguese. When they came to the Bandung Conference, they looked at the Portuguese and at the Frenchmen and at the Englishmen and at the other Dutchmen and learned or realized that the one thing that all of them had in common, they were all from Europe. They were Europeans, blonde, blue-eyed, and white-skinned. They began to recognize who their enemy was. The same man that was colonizing so now he says our people, okay? The pronoun we, let's put it that way, yeah? The same man that was colonizing our people in Kenya was colonizing our people in the Congo. The same one in the Congo was colonizing our people in South Africa and in Southern Rhodesia. Sounds like he's just talking about African solidarity, right? Then he says, and in Burma, and in India, and in Afghanistan, and in Pakistan. Our people, and this is really, really, really important and necessary to talk about, right? I mean, you know, you think that Steve Biko in South Africa, who also had a conception of political blackness, which said that Indians were black, right? Do you think that he didn't understand that he was facing the apartheid system? You know, I mean, they made the pecking order in law, inscribed in law. The Indians were above the blacks, and the coloreds were above the blacks, and the whites were on top. And they separated the university, the thing. And then all of the organizations were organized around the concept of their different community groups. And then when they banned the Pan-African Congress and they banned the ANC, they started to provide some bribes to the Indian organization so that they could join as partners in apartheid. And this is how the Black consciousness movement came and brought Indians into the fold. And I just want to touch on Biko here because, you know, he says something that I think we should really, really focus on. And he says, you know, he says, you know, they want to make the Indian people might be given a vote to swell the buffer zone between whites and Africans, right? Of course, these promises will never be fulfilled, at least not in a hurry, right? And he says, this is the major danger that I see facing the Black community at the present moment. To be so conditioned by the system as to make even our most well-considered resistance to fit within the system, both in terms of the means and the goals, right? Witness the new swing among leaders of the Indian community. I must admit, I say this with pain in my heart. Ever since word was let loose that the Indian Council will, at some near future, be elected, a number of intelligent people are thinking of reviving the Indian Congress and letting it form some kind of opposition within the system. This is dangerous, retrogressive thinkers. And then he says, so these people are not the leaders of the Black people, right? This is in a newsletter that he was written by Sasso. He says, who are the leaders of the Black world then, if they are not to be found in the apartheid institution? Clearly, Black people know that their leaders are those people who are now either in Robben Island or in banishment or in exile. People like Mandela, okay? African. Sobukwe, African. Kathrada, Gujarati. MD Naidu, Indian. You know, he says these are the leaders of the Black people, you know? So, you know, Steve Biko wasn't, someone who didn't understand. Walter Rodney also had a conception of the idea that Black people and Indian people can also be considered under one black category. What was the fate of Biko and what was the fate of Rodney? Both of them were assassinated by the state because that was seen as dangerous. So yes, I'm not saying that those kinds of conditions can come back today, but I'm saying to completely and easily dismiss that stuff on the basis of some mythical notion that Indians are just inherently anti-Black, Palestinians are inherently anti-Black, everybody's inherently anti-Black. That's doing the work of the state. For you would have been loved by the national government in South Africa and by the government, the Black nationalist government of Guyana that killed Walter Rodney.
And the thing is as well, Mohammed, those people are being loved now because people that are perpetuating that are the people who we see getting platforms and doing lectures for The Guardian lately. So, you know, we're seeing these people giving those space. Well, we got to go there because that is what's happening. This is the debate that we need to be happening. It's not, and we're not seeing that, you know, Black Marxist tradition being lifted up and given that platform. No, what we're seeing is this very kind of nationalist, separatist ideology about, you know, places saying they're not going to use BAME again or whatever, or people of colour. It's like, how many times we have to have this conversation with people that these are two very different terms with very different histories. One is from the radical tradition, one is just like a concoction for the state, that's for a census, which, you know, then formulated into who gets funding and therefore led up to separating groups. But then, you know, then it keeps repeating back onto the conversation again and again. And, you know, the worst thing, and I'm still really angry about it, was what happened with BLM recently and that whole saga about who's going to get funding and who's not going to get funding and what racial heritage is of some of, you know, what are some of our most brilliant activists in the UK today. It's like, how dare you reduce people to that? You know, it's actually disgusting. And then to have the sort of cheat to then believe that, you know, therefore that we have to have this kind of, you know, Nazi-like purity of Blackness to be leading an organisation that is there, you know, which has those on the demonstrations, all sorts of people were there. All sorts of people were there. This was like a across the UK thing. Small little towns that barely have any Black people were having, you know, their movement. And then you want to sort of like turn against that and make it a thing about purity.
Yeah.
Which then in itself wouldn't even end up being able to fund anybody, because as we know, as people who work on the ground in activist movements, there's all types of people in there. There's all types of fantastic people doing work. You know, there's some white Jewish lawyers who are doing the most, you know, radical socialists straight in the police station, getting young black men out every day. And yet we're going to exclude those people from support and funds to help those young black men. This is ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous.
I mean, I just on this topic, I really want to talk about the Black consciousness movement in South Africa, because I think it gives the biggest important thing. Just want to read that same brochure that I was reading by Steve Biko. He says, what in fact is happening is that the Black world is beginning to be completely fragmented, and that people are beginning to talk sectional politics, right? I would rather like to believe that this was foreseen long ago by the Nationalist Party, and that is in fact a part of the program of the government, you know, he's saying. After the kind of noises made by Buthelezi, the Labour Party, and the late Matanzima, who can argue that Black opinion is being stifled in South Africa. Moreover, any visitor is made to see that these people are fighting for more concessions in their own area, 13% of the land, because whites took up the rest of the land, so it was only 13% of the land back to Black, and then the Black people were arguing, they were fighting against each other, and we already understand what Biko's conception of what Black means. And he says, they accept that the rest of South Africa is for whites. Also, none of them sees himself as fighting the battle for all Black people. Xhosas wants their Transkei, the Zulus their Zululand, colored people harbor secret hopes of being classified as brown Afrikaners and therefore meriting admittance into the white lager, while Indian people might be given a vote to swell the buffer zone between whites and Africans, you know? So what happens when this fragmentation happens is it's actually in the purpose of the state, right? And it becomes this kind of competition over the bottom of the barrel, the scrapes at the bottom of the barrel. And so the abandonment of a third world internationalist politics, which says that, for example, the fate of the Palestinian or the fate of people struggling in the third world is intimately connected with the fate of Black people. And this turn into Britain, and then into the fight for the foundation money, and then into the fight for who gets the mandate, and all of the organizations fighting against each other for the little pittance of money that's left there, so that they can be as the representatives of their community and get their concession. All of that is actually in the interests of maintaining the system and allowing for the social management of competing communities, okay? And so this is all just really, really, really important for us to understand that those people who have tried their very best to maintain bonds of solidarity in the face of these games that are played directly by the state, but also through the discourses that we may use when we are saving taxpayer money and doing the job of the MI5 for them through our reactionary kinds of politics. That kind of thing is in the interests of the system, in the interest of the state, and will continue to allow for the domination of Black people in a society. I mean, we have to recognize something, that fighting for the bottom of the scrapes of the barrel, when you take, for example, a donation of, I don't know, £1 million and distribute it to all of the different nonprofit campaign groups, right? That money itself, by the time it's already all distributed anyways, is probably just a tiny portion of what they would have gotten from a foundation anyways. But if you could take that kind of thing and build a true internationalist kind of politics, which links the struggle of Black people here with the struggle of Black peoples in the slums in Mazare fighting police violence, and Black people in the struggles of Trinidad and Tobago, but also across the third world, that is the kind of politics that they're terrified from, okay? That is the kind of politics that has teeth. And that's why I'm worried that we're throwing away. You know, people make it seem like you are a traitor to the Black people if you have anything to say against these new popular discourses, these ethno-nationalist understandings of race that don't differ very much from how the colonizers used to speak about us. Everybody learns the basics of when they go to a school or university, whatever, and even those who don't. Race is a social construct. They learn that for 2 minutes and then they throw it away, and then they take up ethno-nationalist understanding of race as being something to do with genes. Race is never about the genes. Race is about the social management of populations. And I just want to say one thing about these new ideas. They are not the cause of all of these problems. They are a reflection, right? The biggest mistake that we had, not a mistake, but it was just the biggest problem, the biggest consequence of the problem is our partial wins. When we partially win in the United States, that creates a condition where the African American becomes the African descendant of slavery, and Black people stop believing in the American dream again. Let's leave out the Blacks. Let's leave out the Caribbeans. Let's leave out the Africans, right? ADOS. Or Afro-pessimism. These guys are, against us. These guys are in solidarity with the white people. They hate, everybody hates us, let's do this our own. And, all of that they buy is this, and this is exactly why Walter Rodney and Biko are both important in this case, right? Because in the apartheid regime, when they banned the African National Congress and the ANC, and then they started wooing the Indian Congress, that created the conditions in which divisions were being sowed, right? And so the political blackness in that context was to bring people back together so that they don't lose their eye on the target, which is the end of the apartheid system, right? In the same way, immediately after decolonization in Guyana, the PPP party, which was the United Indians and Black People under one government, Chedi Dragon's Party, which was a Marxist-Leninist party, got fractured directly by the imperialists so that one side could be seen as the communist wing and the other side could be seen as the capitalist wing. Then they divided them along Black nationalist and Indian lines. Walter Rodney came and adapted the concept of Black power, again, a US concept, in the United States, in Guyana, to unite people so that they could, again, face the target. And that's why they killed him. And that's why they killed Biko. Even the Black Panther Party, which developed its own conception of Black power, why did they kill Fred Hampton? Because he made the Rainbow Coalition, united white people, Puerto Ricans, Mexicans, under one Rainbow Coalition. That's why they killed Fred Hampton. And so whatever people think about this kind of anti-coalition politics, that's fine. If you think that's radical and you think that you're so hard when you say this stuff and that you love your African people and that the Indians are anti-Black and everything, fine. But just know, at least be honest with yourself and with our radical tradition. At least read these texts closely, read Fanon closely, read all of these people closely, and tell me that you're willing to throw the wisdom of a 100-year Black radical tradition in the trash. Because if you are, then let's continue the conversation from there. But don't accuse me or don't accuse anyone else who finds these kinds of ideas as dangerous as being like coons or something, because it's not true. What we care about is protecting a Black radical Marxist tradition that's always been concerned with the fact that the suffering of Black people is related to the twin crimes of colonialism and slavery, and most importantly, that it only maintained through capitalism. Sorry, I'm getting really, really worked up by this, but this is just like how I see these things. And I think that we should not be throwing this stuff away. These are really important lessons we learned from the past.
So I just wanted to say a couple of things and then invite a final reflection before we go out and take some questions from the audience. And it was just sort of twofold. The first being just thinking about the way in which, in the situations you describe in Guyana, in South Africa, also what we've seen in the UK, the way in which we've seen a management from an anti-imperialist politics to a politics of race relations. And just thinking about, actually this morning when I logged onto Twitter, the first thing I saw was a particular Black professor doing a 70 pounder ticket talk for the Guardian about the history of race relations and how that resurrects an idea of us as different groups with essentially different interests, just trying to find some kind of compromise, right? We are inherently African, Black, African, Asian, Indian. These aren't the ways in which we define ourselves. They're things which are in our essence. And essentially, in order to create a sort of public space in which people can thrive, in inverted commas, we have to find a way to find some compromise. And so thinking about the way in which Afro-pessimism describes a coalition as an always already anti-Black formation, right? I think essentially we're not finding common interest or common cause in the way that this politics articulates itself with these groups. Instead, what we're doing is finding some space in which we can compromise on what we want in order to bring other people on board. And that's just not ever been the reality. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about, and just those final notes of your comments, Mohammed, I've had quite a few conversations with you about this question of the, and quite poignant question of the lonely Black Marxist. And I've just sort of been trying to flesh out that idea in response to some of the things we've talked about. But just on the one hand, being called all manner of names, being told that we're tap dancing when we critique the sort of hegemonic Black politics that we're seeing at the moment. Sorry, my daughter's joined us. when we see the sort of, when we critique the sort of hegemonic Black politics that we're seeing at the moment. And then on the other hand, when it comes to, you know, operating within traditionally Marxist spaces, sort of being seen as the riposte to having to think through questions of race. And, you know, as we've discussed, the sort of Adolf Reed figure who sort of soothes the white Marxist. And I was just thinking about it in terms of how we haven't really contended with, in terms of an intellectual history of the Black radical tradition, particularly in that mid-20th century moment, mid to late 20th century, where the analysis of capitalism and the way that it had developed through imperialism is precisely what gave way to the kinds of coalitional politics that we saw, right? The analysis being that imperialism has made the world increasingly interconnected, and therefore our fates are increasingly interconnected, hence why we have to organize in solidarity, and hence why we have to coordinate our efforts. And the way that the pandas articulated that was, they can't fight a war in Vietnam if they're fighting a civil war at home, right? I'm just thinking about the extent to which the absence of that from a Marxist account, and it is a Marxist account of the development of capital and transitions in capital, the absence of that in the sort of hegemonic account mean that we, again, are lacking in a particular language, which is widely understood in order to articulate our expressions of solidarity. And so when we talk about it on social media, on Twitter, when we write about it, when we bring it into meetings, it seems like an alien form. But yeah, I guess what I would say is what I would open for the next couple of minutes before we go to questions is just like a reflection on how it feels, in essence, to be somebody who is a critique, who is a sort of critic of this kind of politics, but not from the standpoint of being a white leftist who, and I'm saying a white leftist who doesn't care about race, you know, identifying a particular politics rather than something which is essential to being white and a leftist, but rather coming from the position of being somebody who emerges from a tradition which is ours, in a sense.
Absolutely. I mean, do you want to go, Chardine?
Yeah, I'm just was just thinking about that. How does it feel to be that person sometimes stuck between a rock and a hard place? And, you know, I think what Mohammed said earlier about, you know, how it is really about us really sort of genuinely caring about the liberation of our people. I think sometimes people can misconstrue it and think we're on some sort of kumbaya trip, you know, peace, love and light and all of that kind of stuff, when actually it's the complete opposite of that. And I think, you know, people feel like you're dismissing their experiences of racism from other groups as not being important or not being hurtful, actually, because a lot of this is about, you know, like a personal pain, which, you know, I think is quite reflective in Milderson's work. But, you know, we've all had those experiences. We've all been followed around shops. We've all, you know, all that sort of stuff. But, you know, this is, it's sort of a training of the mind to think sort of beyond that personal and think into the political. And I feel like that is the kind of language that's kind of lacking. And to be honest, from what I have seen now, is that I actually, I'm going to say put the blame at the door, but I'm going to anyway, so it's probably going to upset a lot of people. But like 5 years ago, these kind of conversations were quite similar in the queer space, where everything was that sort of post-structuralist, kind of individualist, everything's kind of not separated away from class and structures. And we're talking about our own experience all the time. And then that's kind of fed in, and I feel like that kind of started to come into Black feminist spaces. And then from Black feminist spaces, it's now moved into the kind of broader Black political space. So there's a sort of journey that's happened there that I've witnessed through that time, where I've gone the opposite direction to everyone else, because there was a point where I was like, well, actually, you know, I do understand, you know, I started off, you know, organising around globalisation and stuff like that when I was 18. So capitalism was always like the foundation of where my thinking was going. So yeah, I mean, I think what I would like to see is more of those kind of honest conversations where, you know, we are just talking about, like, we have differences of opinion on how we think our liberation will be. And I think
Exactly.
that's absolutely fine.
That's
However,
fine.
what's happening, and again, this happened in those queer spaces earlier, is that this erasure then makes people feel that they don't actually really need to, but not even engage with those texts, because I do actually think they engage with those texts. I do actually think they read Angela Davis and Fanon and everyone else that's been mentioned today. But I think they just kind of, there's almost like a fear of actually acknowledging what is the words on the page, because it's not going by what everybody else is thinking. And I think that there needs to be, and I've noticed that in the more that me and you and Annie and others talk, constantly getting these messages from people saying that, you know, I thought this, but I wasn't so sure. And, you know, because everyone else is saying this, and it's the same thing again and again and again. So if you step outside the line, then you will be attacked in quite brutal and quite horrible ways, which I don't think even those who went before us probably experienced. I very much doubt that, you know, anyone was calling, you know, for Dubois' head or anything like that, or shaming them in the same way. There was still respect for where that person was coming from, and that's kind of disappeared. So I think that's something that I think this series, which I think is really needed, because it gives people the space to kind of have those conversations and to feel safe to do that without, you know, this kind of bullying, frankly, that's happening out there.
Absolutely. I would just say, like, you know, it's, let it be. I've always found that the thinkers that I have admired the most were also always condemned in their times. You know, you have to understand solitude is going to be really important if you really believe in what you believe. You know, yeah, I feel like, you know, to be on a more personal level, because we've been talking about all these levels of politics and stuff. First of all, when it comes to anti-blackness, I understand the impulse. I lived in Malaysia for a while. I experienced a whole lot of anti-black racism in Malaysia, by the police, by immigration, by landlords, etc. And it wasn't at the hands of white people. I understand that stuff. Okay, but still, you know, like, on the one side, I feel like sometimes it's like a lot of, even, you know, the many white Marxist friends, they want to hear me say that it's got nothing to do with race and it's all about class, right? And that's the market that Adolf Reed and Cedric Johnson fit into. That's not me. So I'm not going to make you happy. And then there's going to be the black, there's going to be the black people who want me to fetishize myself as saying that there's no such thing as my liberation until the abstract end of the world, the apocalypse, which is, you know, for me, an idea that actually comes from Christianity, you know, not necessarily the politics of liberation. And I'm not saying Christianity doesn't have those streaks in them, it does, but I'm just saying that that's millenarian and it doesn't do anything for me, you know. And they want me to fetishize my blackness. And you know what? Like, I'm gonna read just some lines, and I want people to guess who said them. This is world. In this world, which is already trying to disappear, do I have to pose the problem of the black truth? Do I have to be limited to the justification of a facial confirmation? I, as a man of color, do not have the right to seek to know in what respect my race is superior or inferior to another race. I, as a man of color, do not have the right to hope that in the white man there will be a crystallization of guilt toward the past of my race. I, as a man of color, do not have the right to seek ways of stamping down the pride of my former master. I have neither the right nor the duty to claim reparation for the domestication of my ancestor. There is no Negro mission, there is no white burden. I find myself suddenly in a world in which things do evil, right? He says, there is no white world. He says, I have no wish to be the victim of the fraud of the black world. My life should not be devoted to drawing up the balance sheet of Negro values. There is no white world, there is no white ethic, any more than there is a white intelligence. There are in every part of the world men who search. I am not a prisoner of history. I should not seek there for the meaning of my destiny. I should constantly remind myself that the real leap consists in introducing invention into existence. Right? And another one.
Answers in the chat, folks.
Yeah. You may have heard this quote before, but you may have misread it because people don't read this stuff properly. Sorry, just one last thing.
While you do that, if we could just get some guesses quickly, and then we're gonna have to move on to questions because I've just realized we're already at
okay, but one last one. This one is gonna be the biggest hint. All right, it is not. You might have heard this quote, but you may have heard someone misread it on purpose. But it is not because the Indo-Chinese has discovered a culture of his own that he is in revolt. It is not because the Indo-Chinese has discovered a culture of his own that he is in revolt. It is because, quite simply, it was in more than one way becoming impossible for him to breathe. Okay, can guess.
Okay, so I just... Can anyone guess? Let's see if anyone puts up their hand. We haven't got any answers yet, but should we shock them because I know who it is?
Yeah, that's who I was going to say as well.
No, those are the words of Fanon.
That's right. That's right.
It's so remarkable that he
well done, everyone.
Taken on in the way that he has by the Afro-pessimists, given that everything in his work works against their account. Okay, so now we're going to go to questions because I'm conscious of time. So Barbara, Barbara can turn on her camera and let us see. So she...
Okay.
So Barbara's the amazing person who helped us get this Zoom account, and also is in the background. So if Barbara could pick a couple of people, should we start with? I'm going to be really strict and say 2-minute questions.
Okay, so people have 2 minutes to make contributions. Before we do that, somebody sent a Q&A that I want to read out really quickly. So they said, I'd be interested if the panelists have any thoughts about how the Black feminism of the following decades related to the historical tradition and thinkers that have been discussed most during this discussion.
I mean, well, they were part of that tradition. And I think, again, this sort of, where we start separating things out as if these people were not in conversation with each other, creates this sort of idea that, the Black feminist tradition was something other. But actually, when you even look at, something like the Combahee River Collective Statement, or look at the work of OAD that was happening in the UK, they were all part of different struggles. Some of them were still members of the British Panther movement, as well as OAD, or doing other work around, SUS. So, they were as part of that. In how this is sort of connected to, the sort of last decade, which I guess is like my generation, really. At the very beginning, actually, there's a few people out there who are, causing a lot of problems. I remember being in a politically black feminist group. We were all in a politically black feminist group. And so those politics were there. So it shocks me that people can go from that space where we were learning from each other around, colorism within our communities, or caste and versus class in the sort of Caribbean community, and how these things kind of crossed over, these connections, to where they are now. And I just think I see it as being the trajectory of what people call white feminism, which I don't like the term because frankly it's just liberal feminism. Anybody can participate in it. And where Black feminism have now become one and the same thing. And so they've created this false dichotomy between Black feminism, which is supposedly something different, when actually the politics are exactly the same as what is happening with white feminism. So there's been a complete sort of disconnect there from Black feminism, which was always a socialist tradition from day one. Literally in the Combahee River Collective, it will say, we are socialists, we are Marxists even. They talk about that, and they talk about why, they bring race into it, etc. And they talk about why they needed to create that group, because they weren't that conversation in white Marxist feminist spaces. And then in liberal kind of, you know, feminist spaces, then there wasn't even a conversation around class. So that's why they created that group. And the same with OAD as well. So it is extremely frustrating. I see what Annie wants to say to me. I see it is extremely frustrating to see how we keep seeing ourselves as part of this kind of, well, not me, but others see themselves as part of this Black feminist tradition, when the politics have no connection to that tradition whatsoever.
I was just thinking about the ways in which, I guess, there's like a fissure in the Black feminist tradition. And part of that fissure is based on, and this is similar to the sort of destruction or dismantling of political Blackness as a project, in which you have some kind of mythological originary sin, or betrayal, sorry, I should say. And I'm just thinking about the construction of the Black Power era as an articulation of Black macho, of the Black militant as being always gendered as a Black male, when in reality these movements had, you know, very militant women who are writing incredible work, but don't sort of get venerated in the same way as people like Huey Newton, etc. And I remember years ago when I was writing a dissertation on gender in the Panthers, coming across an interview with some women who were Panthers, and they got asked about, you know, Black feminist separatist organizing. And they made an incredible point, which has really stuck with me, which is that, you know, if your concern is, and it's not to say that it's not painful, certain experiences that you'll have when you're organizing with people who may have prejudices, but if your concern is the liberation of all people, then it is also your revolutionary duty to be a part of these movements in order to steer and change the conversations, right? Mm-hmm. If you're organizing in silos, and I think that's just something which is also typical of the sort of Black feminists who get venerated today, but their politics aren't really interrogated that much. People like Angela Davis, right? Who talks about Black feminism, writes on Black feminism, but is also actively engaged, not just in movements which are populated by Black women, but organizes with people across different boundaries, right? And that process of struggle is being transformative, as breaking down sort of stereotypes and prejudices that people may have, as giving clarity about what our aims are and what our interests are and how they align, has completely been lost. And I think there was a moment in which Black feminism became flattened as this thing which was simply to say that Black women are the bottom of the pile. So even if we're going to talk about Blackness as anti-Blackness, Black women are even now, and the tools of Black feminism, it became appropriation to use the tools of Black feminism to describe any other form of oppression, things like intersectionality, etc., which I have my own issues with.
I have my issues with that. We can discuss that. That's a whole other episode about intersectionality. But, you know.
We should take another question. Sorry, we might run over slightly.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, should we just say we probably want to extend it for another 10 minutes if people are okay? Yeah. Okay, cool. So I will take one question up now. So Fatima, I have allowed you to speak and I've asked you to unmute so you can make your contribution, and you have 2 minutes. Hi Fatima, we've unmuted you so you can speak.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Hi, I just wanted to, I've pretty much written it out in the question, so I really don't have a problem you reading it out for me. Yeah.
I can't see it, so you probably... I can see it. Oh, I can read it for you. I like Mohammed's contribution using Biko's work. I'd like to ask his thoughts on how Gandhi was utilised as, quote, the Indian to fight for Indian causes in South Africa. How do we approach that history? How do we critique that and his position vis-a-vis Black Africans, which he later tried to rewrite when he launched his political activism in India? If you click on the Q&A, you can see it, Mohammed.
Yeah. I think that like Gandhi was a complicated person, but there's no denying that like he acted against the interests of unity in the apartheid struggle and sought to make compromises against Black Africans. There's no denying that. And I completely sympathize even to a certain degree about some of the movements that are trying to pull down his statue in Ghana. But there's another aspect of this, and this is really important. I think like Stokely Carmichael is really important here. Right? He says something about like, if you have a problem with me, that's your problem, right? If you can do something about it, that's my problem. And so that talks also not just about the fact that like what he meant by when he coined the term institutional racism, but it's also about the fact that politics is sometimes just about real politics, you know. The same Gandhi who has that complicated history was the same Gandhi who inspired Martin Luther King Jr., right? And there was even Paul Robeson. I think he was very aware as a communist, you know. He was very aware of the role of Gandhi's probably in South Africa, but he also engaged in, and this is what it means to be engaged in politics with someone, and that's something that we should also learn today, is when the interests aligned, especially when it came like post-World War II, the Atlantic Charter and the promise of decolonization, especially the interests of Indian decolonization and the interests of African Americans in the United States and African diaspora in Africa and the Caribbean, there was a coalition, a small coalition, right? That didn't say, you're so problematic, like we're never gonna work with you. It wasn't like that. It was like, okay, you have some kind of influence in India and you have a name, and let's enter into that kind of politics. And then we can abandon our coalition later, and et cetera, because that is the art of politics. The art of politics is a very serious thing. It's got nothing to do with a person's history or past, and that's a perfect example, right? Just on the term of the Young Patriots, was a member of the coalition Black Panther Party. They had as their flag the Confederate flag, you know, before they abandoned it. And Fred Hampton still understood that he needed to enlist the help of poor whites because of real politics. They wanted to fight against police brutality. Eventually, through that process of coalition, they abandoned their racist ideas. But the point was, again, it wasn't that put down that flag, that's problematic. It was about like, we need to engage in politics, let's engage in politics. And so that's something that we should understand about the legacy of Gandhi, but also in terms of the lesson of Gandhi. Gandhi at one point was the enemy of the African people in South Africa, and at another point ended up being an ally to the Black anti-colonial struggles and the struggles for nonviolent civil rights, the nonviolent movement of civil rights in the United States, because at that time there was an understanding that the art of politics is not necessarily about the person, than it is about the balance of power and shifting that in your favor.
I would just add one thing to that, which is to say that the types of people who get put up on social media as examples of like the anti-Blackness of non-Black POC are almost invariably wealthy, middle-class people who don't share our politics, aren't coming from the same place as us, aren't interested in questions of liberation, whether for our people or for theirs. And so I think one of the other things we have to sort of learn is this same thing we talked about before, where Wilderson uses his friend Samir as like a sort of a plot device to represent all Palestinians.
Imaginary friends.
Yeah, the question is whether or not our politics are aligned, whether or not our interests are aligned, and not whether or not our morality aligns. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, and just one more thing on this is like, look, we made the biggest mistake. You know, this is, you know, we've created monsters, right? Have you heard of Candace Owens? Right wing Black woman commentator turned up by Turning Point USA. When Turning Point UK came here, they also looked for a Black woman to represent them. You know, Turning Point became famous because there was a picture of them and they were all white, like, and that went viral, and that's how Turning Point became famous and ridiculed, and it rebranded itself. And yeah, I don't know if you've seen the institutional racism investigation, the very diverse number of people there who deny the existence of institutional racism. I mean, why is it anti-Blackness when an Indian does that, but when a Black person does that, it's coonery? You know, I mean, there's this analytical inconsistency there. You know, let's just be honest. Yeah, you know, you can have I'm not saying there's no differences in power. There is, and I can tell you from my personal experience that I lived as a Black person and was a victim of racism by people in power in Malaysia and whatever, and that's something else. But like, the more we start to play this stupid game of saying that your color of your skin will represent the interests of your community, the more we give that ammunition to the right to just continue to engage in the same kind of identity politics to you know, empower these people on the right wing. Because guess what? It turns out, in fact, that you can have an anti-Mexican Black person, you can have and you can have a Black right-wing person. It turns out that that's just a thing in real life, you know? I mean, come on.
Okay, we're going to take the next question, which is Shanice. Shanice, I've allowed you to talk and I'm asking you to unmute, and then you can question or contribution. You've got 2 minutes and I am timing you because we've got to keep to time.
Hi everyone, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Loud and clear.
Woohoo! Thank you so much for calling me on and actually for hosting this. It's been absolutely amazing. Just wanted to reflect on the comments on Blackness always having been political, and in particular, the reflection that historically it's been a radical project of framing Blackness in opposition to whiteness, specifically where whiteness was political in the sense of representing like a global system of racist capitalist oppression. And I think what's interesting now is Blackness, particularly in this moment in the UK, is actually not political in terms of opposition to capitalism or even a vague notion of whiteness, but actually it's opposed to particularly South Asian people. And in many ways, like the political project of Blackness is specifically now about separation and exclusivity, which really mirrors like the ideology of the state and, you know, white supremacists, obviously. And I think that's reflected like most recently in what happened to, you know, Josh on Twitter, like the horrific tirade against someone who actually happens to be Black and of South Asian descent. But what's interesting is that kind of same energy doesn't seem to apply to people who share white parentage. And I'm not saying that it should at all, but it's really interesting that we're in a moment where the politicization of Blackness means that having South Asian heritage brings your Blackness into question, whereas having white heritage doesn't. And I mean, I guess this foolishness is only really possible when we've lost a collective and ideological belief in total global Black liberation. And
Absolutely.
precisely the people that we need to unite with to make liberation possible, South Asian people, but the working class generally. And in a context, you know, where we don't believe winning is possible, they actually become our competitors rather than our comrades. And they only ever become our comrades when they've earned the right to through some sort of weird ablution process. So I guess, I guess my question I want to ask is, when did we lose that belief in the possibility of Black revolution and Black liberation? And the second thing I want to raise is, really quickly, I think we need to start identifying ourselves and create a line in the sand, so to speak. So I'm proposing that we begin organizing our ideology, our practice, under the banner of Afro-Marxism, which can be a term that holds different views, different strategies under one term, but actually captures our radical history as Black revolutionaries and takes the best part of like Black feminist and Black queer thought and practice, but is actually a direct call out in contrast to Afro-progressivism, but crucially believes like in the revolutionary power of our people.
Absolutely.
I'm 100% up for that. Actually, and I just wanted to talk about what Shanice brought up, because I think it's really important. And I think particularly, you know, us as Afro-Marxists, we need to reach out to our South Asian siblings and brothers and sisters, because some of the stuff that I have witnessed, particularly on social media and other places, is actually borderline on abusive. And it's actually quite disgusting and quite frightening. And people think that just because we're Black, we can get away with saying outright racist things about other people who are also experiencing racism. And, you know, as some of you might have seen, even just expressing even an olive branch of solidarity is enough for you to be called a coon, to be called this and to be called that. You know, and now what we're starting to seeing is, and again, this is, you know, people, you know, might not know about what Afro-pessimism. I hope you do go off and read about it and find out for yourselves. But, you know, how this language has gone into the mainstream has meant that they've created this new world theory where it's Black people versus Black versus everybody else. And I'm starting to see people put Indigenous Americans, South Asian people, anybody else into the same category as white people, which is just absurd. And it also completely denies the reality, not only of our world, but also even just in the UK. And I think this is why people couldn't even mention the race of those people that were caught up in the boohoo sweatshops in Leicester. Because to admit that would then to admit that everything else that they've decided to believe is, you know, a concoction of nonsense. And, you know, sometimes daily, even to my email address now, I get messages from people who, you know, are scared to speak out. And like you said, unless they kind of, you know, go along with this kind of self-flagellation of what a terrible person they are as an anti-Black Asian, then therefore, you know, they can't participate or even talk about their own problems. It's like there's a whole world of, you know, conversation I want to hear and I want to learn about that goes on. You know, what's the difference between, you know, material circumstances between Indian and Bangladeshi or Pakistani or what have you. You know, I want to hear and learn about these things because we have similar things going on in our communities, but we don't, because it's essentially just become a shut up, you know, just be, you know, do the donkey work for us. You don't get to say anything, which is just horrific. It's actually horrible. And, you know, I know it's hard for people to speak out about that, but I really do hope people actually start to push it back against this. Actually. And I think it's just a process that we might have to go through.
I mean, you know, I just think that it's kind of like the enabling of abuse in the name of fighting against it, you know? Like, you have someone who just sits there and just takes all your shit and self-flagellates in front of you in some weird, like, kinky nightmare that we all live in. And now they just want to expand the scope of that to also include Indians as well, you know? I mean, it's just like, honestly, it's not right. But beyond just that, I mean, I wasn't really concerned about this whole Black political Blackness stuff, because I thought it doesn't matter if you call yourself Black or not. That would have maybe been a useful term in the past, and maybe it's okay, just a term. If it's a question of language, fine, find another word. I don't care, you know. But now it's literally against the very idea of coalition building. I mean, that is just awful. You know, that's just really, really awful. And
someone did ask us about POC and its connection to political Blackness. And, you know, again, it is just that thing. It's a different term, but underlying it is still the same politic. And now we're seeing a, you know, reaction against that.
I think one of the things that hasn't, you know, so when I talk about political Blackness, very often, you know, people just assume you want to return to that moment. People just assume that you're nostalgic for a moment that doesn't exist, but they don't realize that actually you're a Marxist, and you realize that over time, the forces of capital change, the like social reality changes. And so as a consequence of that, the languages that can take root and spread change. So I've never been a proponent of going back to political Blackness. But one of the things that I find in this moment, so yeah, there's this attack on the very idea of solidarity, but I think there's also a responsibility on our part to do the work. And when I say the work, what I mean is, you know, opening the spaces for conversation, etc., with like-minded people, recognizing that, yeah, we're probably going to be in the minority, even if Afro-pessimists want to present themselves as being sort of attacked within the academy. Amazing. And then also doing the organizing work. And I think one of the things that's true, just to go back to Shanice's question, one of the things that's true of this generation is that mass organizing hasn't really been something we've grown up with. We are coming from, and just to situate this within the British context, organizationally, we're coming from a period of relative inactivity or invisible activity. And prior to that, we had the sort of 2014 to 2016 moment in which we had the sort of rise of organizations whose logic, and I recognize that there were, you know, relative benefits to that politics, but like the organizational politics was around a tiny number of people doing very public stunts, getting loads of publicity, generating a conversation, but we never really moved beyond that in terms of generalizing that out. And I think organization is so important because it is precisely through the experience of struggle. You know, when young Black kids go out on demos and they're being told on Twitter that nobody else gives a damn about you, but it's the middle of a pandemic and you look to your left and there's an Asian, you look to your right and there's a white kid, like that's the kind of experience that breaks down that kind of politics. the silo of never having to organize with people, the silo of only listening to what gets retweeted onto your Twitter thread. And we know that Twitter operates with an algorithm, right? And you see things that you've engaged with before, you see things that you're more likely to want to engage with, right? You don't see the other side of the story. And that other side of the story only comes from physicality, only comes from being on the demo, seeing how multiracial it is, only comes from being a part of an organization and seeing how committed people of other races are to the question of your liberation through the shared interest that you have. And I think that's the kind of duty that we have. Because I think in that period where we've had like an absence of mass organizing, what has replaced it is Twitter, politics by Twitter. And that's where you get the sort of situation in which people view the labor that they do on Twitter as being radical, revolutionary, when in reality it's just our talking shop. My daughter's in the background, sorry.
Okay, Annie, I'm gonna assume chair so we can get through these questions because there's a lot of it. This is not a coup, this is with your consent.
The FBI coup.
We have Awate, so I'm gonna allow you, Awate. I'm asking you to unmute so you can. You've got 2 minutes and I am gonna time you. I'm sorry, I'm gonna cut you off at 2 minutes because we've got 9 minutes left of this meeting. Okay, you've unmuted so you can speak now.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Go for it.
All right. Happy Sunday, everyone. Thank you for doing this. Yeah, so when a lot of these conversations have been had on Twitter, it's reminded me of growing up in this country. I grew up in London. And I grew up in a very multicultural school, very multicultural schools, primary and secondary. Really quickly, just throughout that entire process, it seemed as if in primary school, we'd have arguments and we'd play football, black v white. When we got to secondary, it became like Caribbeans v West Africans. When we got into sixth form, the arguments became Nigerians v Ghanaians. So they became like smaller and smaller each time. I'm East African, I'm from the Horn of Africa. I got told on a regular basis.
1 minute left.
Cool. I got told on a regular basis, you're not black, you're Somali. Which itself is the maddest thing. I'm not even from Somalia. You know, so I mean, are Somalis not anyway? So at the time, we were protesting against the war on terror, while we had a lot of Islamophobia come towards us. My question is, even though there's a lot of racism and Islamophobia within the black community, black African community, South Asian community, and Arabs especially, do you think homogenized religious spaces, such as black churches, which are mainly just Caribbean, or black churches which is mainly West African, play a part in making this one idea of blackness? Like if you were part of the transatlantic slave trade, that's it, you're black. If you're not, there's big problems, and we're gonna debate it. Thank you.
Very good question.
Just to
sorry, I'm gonna take another question and then you can all
okay.
Okay.
Right. Okay. So Tej, I've asked you to unmute. You have the floor. You have 2 minutes. I'm gonna time you and then I'm gonna cut you off. I'm so sorry.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear. Go for it.
Thanks so much for putting this on, guys. Yeah, it's been really brilliant. I guess I'm still thinking this through, and I've been thinking it through for a while. But I guess I've been worried about the simplifications that I see on these debates on both sides. I was talking to another organizer friend recently, and we were talking about the sense of being between camps, you know, and another friend who was saying that behind a lot of the kind of ugly vitriol that we've seen online, you know, is information that's useful for our politics. And so I think it's important when we're seeing these things to ask, like, where have our politics failed so much that people feel like that is the response to push for? And, you know, I think when I see these things, I think some of that must have been behind like what went into writing the Combahee River Statement. This idea that we're all we have. Do you know what I mean? And that there are ways in which we're not taken care of. Our interests aren't acknowledged or articulated properly in spaces, and therefore we do need to just hide in our own enclaves and protect each other. And I'm wondering about how we can be slightly more critical in how we move forward, rather than dismissing people and saying that they're stupid or they don't understand. Because I actually see a lot of that rage as being something that can be quite generative for our politics. You know, in a lot of spaces that I'm in at the moment, we're having these hard chats about where movements have failed. If we want to take the Black Panthers, for example, you know, I've been working at an archive. I've been able to speak to elders about how people treated each other and where people failed. And what that says about the future of our politics, I think, is really important. So if we take like the Black Panthers, for instance, you hear so many awful stories about how particular men spoke to particular Black women. And I feel like something in that is replicated in the articulation of our politics and our interests. Am I cut off now?
No, I mean, I think that's a really good point, Tej, and I think, you know, and I think, yeah, definitely online culture does mean, because of characters, that people can end up being quite short with each other, which isn't actually reproductive in the long run. But I mean, you know, I would slightly disagree with the idea that we can only look after and protect ourselves, because we, I mean, as you said, you know, within, you know, Black organising, we haven't protected ourselves within those spaces. And I know, even just from my own personal experiences working within Black feminist spaces with, you know, women of African diaspora heritage, they've also been quite toxic spaces. So I think now I've kind of reached a point where I'm like, you know, I mean, it sounds very wishy-washy, but it is very much like I'm just going to work with people who genuinely want to work towards our liberation and have respect to with other people within those groups. And that's what works for me. I mean, you know, it's a very, in a way, it's been quite a sad and painful experience having to sort of realise that. But in another way as well, it's been quite liberating to kind of free myself from that as well.
Can I just say that, like, to be more reflective, you know, I can get really passionate about these things, but I don't have any intentions whatsoever to imply that the other side of the debate don't think, or they don't know how to, you know, or that there's nothing reasonable coming from the other side of the debate. You know, like I said, when I was growing up in Malaysia, you know, I feel like I could have been very susceptible to an understanding of Afro-pessimism, because a lot of the personal experiences of what you call racism, very vicious kinds of racism, you know, have also been at the hands of people who I'm exactly arguing that we should be entering into alliances with. You know, I don't deny that our experiences can do that. And also in terms of the question of autonomy, I mean, that's the whole purpose of the Black Liberation Movement in the first place, right? The whole purpose of the Black Liberation Movement is to say, yeah, even those of us who are Afro-Marxists, we still need to focus on the liberation of Black people, because there's particular things that we have to take into consideration. And of course, that doesn't end just within the umbrella of Black, but women, queer, etc., etc. And there has to be a way in which we can have a conversation about autonomy, but also have a conversation about real polity, right? About, we have to take care of ourselves in the process of politics. We also have to have coalitions with other people, because politics is both something that we need to recharge from, but it's also something that we need to win. And the question is more on the question of winning, you know, and the political culture of saying that we need to come together and focus on ourselves. If that entails sending out vitriol to people of other races, etc., I mean, I don't want to sound wishy-washy, but I don't know if that's healing for the self either, you know? I think, in fact, that has a way of, when you start to look around people surrounding you with suspicion, including white people, that has a way of eating you inside as well. And that's probably even less productive for the longevity of struggle than it is to be witnessing all of this kind of abuse, you know? And I think that that's something that I think we also need to have a conversation about, is to be kind to each other, but also to be kind to most people. in the world, and understand that, like, before we read Marx, before we read all of this stuff, we were concerned with very simple things. Why are people homeless? Why are people being beaten up for the color of their skin? Why do people not have food on the table? Why are some people working in sweatshops? All of this stuff, we forget about it, you know? And I know that sounds like a very banal, simple point, but that's what we did this for in the first place, at least for me, you know? I didn't have any, even as a young child, I didn't have any natural alliance and understanding of, I'm doing this for my people, the Black people alone. I always said, I just want the world to be a better place for everybody, you know? And I think that the most simple thing is something that we forget beyond this stuff. So I'm not trying to imply that people are stupid, and I'm sorry if in any way some of my critiques and criticisms came off as patronizing.
So I think
I know you guys. We still have like 3 more questions to answer, and it's 1:50. So I don't know.
Another 10 minutes. I think I just want to go back to Awate's question as well, actually, in terms of this kind of going through childhood into, you know, the teenage years. And it's funny, I was actually having a conversation the other day trying to explain to a white male friend I've had for a very long time. It's not very, you know, they're vaguely sort of lefty, they're not super political. And someone else friends with from like the music scene. And they were saying they were watching these conversations that were happening online, because we think these are just internal conversations, but people were observing and watching and seeing, and it's reaching into, you know, mainstream spaces, and they're like, what's going on? And he said, when I was at school, you know, I remember this kind of thing that Awate was talking about, and actually there was, you know, pea bashing was still like a big thing in the 70s. And he said what, you know, was going on was like you had sort of Black kids and white kids were seen as the cool kids, and then the South Asian kids were seen like these kind of wimpy sort of nerdy people that people used to beat up all the time. And so that whole kind of like era, now we're sort of talking about in a very different way, as if those things weren't very real and didn't happen to people. And then there's always been this hierarchy of, you know, white, Asian, Black at the bottom. And so it's interesting to hear what Awate was talking about in terms of how these kind of sort of things start to develop within the school environment, which I think is incredibly toxic. And I actually think a lot of trauma has been created in those spaces from people are playing out as adults as well. We keep seeing the same kind of conversations. And I grew up in a majority white school, so I had all kinds of shit to put up with. But I do think we really need to be a bit more sort of self-reflective on these kind of traumatic experiences that we've had as we've grown up, and not shy away from them. Actually be really honest about, you know, I grew up in a household where, you know, my whatever person said that all Asian people were thieves, all Polish people are that. There seems to be this kind of thing that we're like these perfect victims that don't perpetuate any kind of prejudice at all. And that kind of formative time of teenagers where you're starting to listen and hear and understand what is going on and what your community is doing, and you're developing your identity as a Black Caribbean person, as a Black African person in that, you know, 14, 15, 16 time. It's interesting then to see how these attitudes start to develop around that time. I think, Annie, we had this conversation about that as well.
I mean, I remember there was like a moment on Twitter, I can't remember exactly what sparked it, but Chardine just came into one of our group chats and was like, what happened at secondary school in London? What was it actually like? Because how has it produced people who are so traumatized? And, you know, the thing about cancel culture, which has been articulated itself on Black Twitterers pulling up tweets about dark-skinned girls that people said or people made 5-6 years ago, is that everyone's experience, okay, I won't say everyone, but the vast majority of people who I've spoken to who aren't involved in politics, who grew up around me, who are young Black women and men, had a very similar experience in school, and it was a very toxic space. It was a very traumatizing space, in which, in essence, the fault line or the dividing line at that point was Africans versus Caribbean. Nobody wanted to be African. Everybody wanted to be Caribbean. and especially in schools where you had a majority of or a significant minority of Black students, and all us Africans got called black and dark and all of the sort of names under the sun. And I feel like what's happened is a lot of that trauma has never really been processed, and it's been carried across. And that's why, you know, going back to Tej's question, I understand where it's coming from. I understand the deep pain that's articulating itself. And I'm thinking about the sort of history within the feminist movement of consciousness raising, of making people aware of just how painful and how deep the experiences of being oppressed in particular ways are. But also thinking about the necessity of separating those out from political spaces. And I don't say that to dismiss it. I've had to sort of battle with it. I've had to sort of battle with various different issues which arise from traumas from my youth. But rather sort of thinking about how those traumas can sometimes cloud our minds because they come from a work of ideology, and therefore cloud our minds to the actual root of the system, right? So if I was to go from my secondary school experiences, it would be Black men who are the sort of enemy of my progress, enemy of my liberation. And if I brought that into political spaces, which we are seeing, all that produces is a articulation or an articulation of Black men as being more in opposition to my liberation, my emancipation as, say, the state. And suddenly the conversation becomes about the prejudices of Black men, where that's something that's much more changeable within the context of politically organizing. They're a group that I have a significant number of shared interests with, rather than the actual structure which produces their thought. And if we think about social constructions, yeah, they're like not rooted in things which are, they're real, but they're not, essential. But the other thing about social constructions is that they're made possible by a set of social conditions. And if we're to have a systemic analysis, the opinions, the beliefs, the vitriol of individuals can't be treated as more important than the conditions which produce those opinions and, you know, vitriol. And I think that's the kind of essence of what we've been trying to get across, that maybe has been missing from the conversation. I don't know if people feel like that might be a good place to end, or should we continue?
There's 3 more questions, and people are saying they want to hear the questions in the chat. So
okay, that's good.
If you feel like you can't, thank you very much. Feel free. Okay, so we have one from Barnaby, right? And it says, sometimes today it's suggested that the poles of this debate pit Afro-pessimism against intersectionality, which is more interested in coalition building. I know some of you are skeptical of that choice. Can you talk about why? I don't know if I want to, there's 2, okay, do this. You have 3 minutes to do this. I'm so sorry, I don't need to be like this. We want to get through all of them. Okay.
I just want to say to Barnaby's questions that I don't see intersectionality as part of a Marxist tradition anyway. I see it as coming as from a sort of like liberal tradition that doesn't really sort of challenge the actual state itself. It's more kind of like our sort of individual interactions are. So for me personally, I don't know about anybody else, I don't know if I would put it against Afro-pessimism, because I actually see them actually being more closely connected in how I see them being used. But I don't know if anyone else thinks any differently.
Okay,
I saw agreement on the panel, so I'm gonna move on. Sorry.
Oh no. I have a disagreement.
What Barnaby was getting at is that the frustration for me is people treat intersectionality as the language of coalition building, when in reality intersectionality produces precisely what we were talking about earlier, where we think about race relations instead of liberation, racial liberation, right? In which the framework as it's set up by Crenshaw is essentially that we need redress after the fact. The fact of oppression is taken as a given. The existence of all of these forms of oppression are taken as a given, but we just have to manage that afterwards. We have essential differences in our interests, we just have to manage those differences. And I think that's the kind of place that Afro-pessimism also situates itself in. So because intersectionality doesn't give a content analysis of what the social form of oppression takes, theories like Afro-pessimism insert themselves into an already sort of hungry audience who are looking for an analysis which explains to us why Black people are at the bottom of the basement, but isn't attentive to the changing conditions, especially.
And I think Crenshaw's intersectionality is not coming from the same place as the Combahee River Collective statement in terms of like triple jeopardy, I think was a term used around that time. And Claudia Jones sort of like touched upon that sort of notion as well in her sort of essay about Negro women and class and Marxism. But yeah, and also Crenshaw backed Elizabeth Warren instead of Bernie. So that's all I need to say.
I think also the thing with intersectionality is I mean, you've got the Combahee River Collective, but the other kind of thing that we have to be careful of is reading it back into the past. Intersectionality is a particular language which emerges at a particular moment produced by a particular set of conditions, experiences of organizing, but also transformations in capital more broadly, right? One of the things that people have done is just essentially, in order to absolve itself or sort of shield itself from critique, is treat intersectionality simply as a descriptive tool. It's not doing any more work than just saying that different forms of oppressions overlap. And that is an issue because then we begin to read like radical Marxist feminists, radical Black Marxist politics through the lens of the categories which are set up by intersectionality rather than the particular analysis of social reality and that they're giving us.
Next question.
Next question is, I wanted to ask a question about the role of struggle as the site of transgression in and of itself, and therefore the need of the state to fragment it, and perhaps its accommodation of oppression Olympics as a dynamic through funding schemes, example EU, UN schemes for Africans, whereby North Africans are excluded, etc. Do people have any comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's just that I just think that that's really the root of all of this stuff. I mean, you know, as a Marxist person, you have to. I mean, you don't have to if you want to. You understand that ideas are related. Ideas come not from the minds of people, abstract individuals. Ideas come from the political, material situation that you're in. Right? And I mean, I think that is really the root of all of this. You know, people are. There was an idea at it only makes sense to build a political Black coalition in South Africa or something in the context of apartheid. Here, in the context of you know, the racial struggles that were happening at that time. And the reason why we see all these deformations in thought and going in this direction of Native Americans are more oppressed, no, Black Americans are more oppressed, no, this, that, it's because they're all competing, because to a certain degree we've lost that thing of we're fighting against the system, and we're all kind of, we may use the language of radical stuff, but we're all competing for the script, for the bottom of the barrel, and that's also why we've abandoned the internationalist politics. You know, we had struggles right now as George Floyd protests were going on in the United States, and that's great that we have that level of but we had problems against police brutality in Trinidad and Tobago, and we had problems with police brutality in Mathare and Nairobi, and there was no one was
in Nigeria.
And in Nigeria, I see no one was talking about this. No, who was out in the streets when Haiti was struggling, just like last year. It's gone. A lot of that's gone, you know, and it's because we bought into this idea that we want to get the money from the grants, and we want to get the money from wherever and give it to our organizations and all this other stuff, after pessimism, whatever you want to call it, comes later. I just want to just really quick on that thing about intersectionality. I don't care what you call it. I mean, if your intersectionality is a concept of unity in difference, you recognize difference, you recognize people are different, but that you understand that you have to unite together and fight. If you want to call that intersectionality, that's fine. If you want to call it triple jeopardy, triple oppression, double jeopardy, whatever, I mean, as long as it's that. The concept of double jeopardy, which came before intersectionality, one of the iterations that came before it, was started by a group called the Black Caucus, Black Liberations Women's Caucus, and Students for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the United States. That group, just as an example, the one, Frances Beale, who came out of that group, who coined double jeopardy, changed their name to the Third World Women's Alliance because they wanted to include Puerto Ricans in them. You know, that, and if our intersectionality goes in that direction, then call it intersectionality. If our intersectionality goes in the obsession of the difference, and the suspicion that anything can be overcome, that's a dangerous idea, and we need to do away with it, in my opinion.
Okay, we have to show a remarkable amount of restraint now.
There's one more.
It's the last question.
Where do you think Afro-pessimism and this type of thought is coming from? I think this is a great way to end it. Do you think it's linked to intersectionality and critical theory that focuses too much on identity and not enough on class and capitalism?
I mean, I think the first part of that question, I think of Paul Gilroy writing this coffee table book called Black Britain, which I recommend everyone gets. It's got beautiful pictures of Black Britain, but his writing in it is quite funny because he's kind of writing in a way that he thinks no one's actually going to read the text. And he says something near the end, like this kind of rising of the Black consultant. That's a paranoid Black middle class. And this was in 2001. He was writing that, and that's really where I think, and I've seen other people, I've had discussions with other people around this as well, who sort of follow trajectory, this sort of anxious Black middle class. Remember, Wilderson is from a upper Black middle class, African-American background, and not being able to realize their place within that structure, as well as their discrimination of their Blackness. So, I mean, not to dismiss it too much, but it's a kind of a bit of a nutshell of like, don't you know who I am? Like politics, you know, and not willing to accept that actually, if we're talking about the language of privilege, which I don't really like, but let's just use it because that's what people use, then not really being able to comfortably deal with, in some situations, you are actually the person with the privilege there. And, but then also experiencing racism as well. So I think that's why a lot of people have really kind of caught hold of it, in particular in the States. Here as well, I think there's also a kind of loss of connection in the UK to maybe our countries of heritage, you know, third generation, fourth generation people who are Black British, not feeling as closely tied to, say, my family, Trinidad or Ghanaian or whatever, and not being able to sort of reconcile what their identity is, and maybe there's some sort of shame around the fact that they are just British, and that's it, you know, and so we've got to sort of looking for something else because we're not part of white Britain, because we're not accepted into that, but then trying to, but we are that. Do you know what I mean? I think someone mentioned something earlier about, I can't remember, it was you, Mohammed, who mentioned the sort of thing about being the white man to the Algerian. I think we're in that space, and I think Afro-pessimism fills up that anxiety around that.
Mm. Mohammed, did you want to go, and then I'll go last?
No, I'm done. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, so I think in terms of, my daughter's going to be joining me for this part. In terms of Afro-pessimism, so there's all of the dynamics that Chardine talked about, which I completely agree with. And I think that sort of tells us why it's been taken up so much, as in, or like consented to at some level by sort of young Black people who are being radicalized. But I think there's also another element of it, which is power, which has become something which has been missing from our analyses. Afro-pessimism represents the hegemonic school of thought within America, an imperial state. Therefore, what thought comes out of America trickles down around the world, right? And I've increasingly come to understand Afro-pessimism as, for the same reason Chardine outlined, a sort of political philosophy or political theory for the global north, for the diaspora. And we haven't really contended with the extent to which, in these conversations around Blackness, the voices, the understandings, the wisdom of Black people on the continent, both historically and today, become completely absent. And no one really reads them. People just kind of take, and I think that's just made so obvious in the way in which Afro-pessimism uses this like BS, like boomerang theory, which is to say what happens to African Americans also happens to all Black people. And And in a sense, there is a colonization of Blackness coming from the global North, people with more resources, people with more access to institutional power, therefore shutting out the voices of Black people who come from different backgrounds. And I think it's not an accident that most of the young Black people who are questioning this kind of politics that I see tend to be young Black people coming from working class backgrounds, and then people turn around and attack them as coons and, you know, chucking and jiving to get money, when in reality, the people who are presenting themselves as victims within the academy are the sort of most stable economically and in terms of and institutionally people within Black studies, right? And it's just such a shame that the reality is completely contrary to that. The reality is most people who think critically, see themselves as Black Marxists, would really struggle to get a place in a Black Studies department, would really struggle to get published in a Black Studies journal, whether they're Black or not. And I think that kind of aspect of the rise of Afro-pessimism really has been under-theorized and under-discussed or not talked about enough. I guess, shall we leave it there? The final comrade had a question, has withdrawn the question, but we can certainly take it up afterwards. So the idea of the series, just to sort of wrap up quite abruptly, is that I'm going to be doing these kind of conversations bi-weekly. So the next one is going to be in 2 weeks' time. I'm going to be publishing details of that on Twitter and on Facebook. Going forward, hopefully we will have access to a bigger Zoom, so we'll be able to get more people in. And then we're also going to be recording as we have been doing today. And we're going to put those recordings up on the YouTube channel. Twitter handles, if everybody could pop their Twitter handles into the thread.
I don't use Twitter that much, by the way. But I'll try to get more into it.
Mohammed doesn't really use Twitter, but we've been trying to convince him to. But just want to say thank you so much to Mohammed and to Chardine. Thank you so much to Barbara. This has been such an insightful conversation for me to listen to be a part of, and I'm really pleased that we've been able to do this. I'm really pleased we've been able to hopefully open up a space and make an intervention which I feel is really necessary. I also want to say thank you to everybody who joined us and everybody who stuck around for the extra 45 minutes. Hopefully my timings will get better for the next session.
I think we just need to have this time so we can have more time for the floor, basically.
Yeah. And I just want to promote the idea that sometimes we may feel alone or whatever, but blessed are the heretics. You know, just if you feel that there's an orthodoxy that you're surrounded by and you don't necessarily agree with it, it's better for the person propounding that orthodoxy and for yourself to challenge it, whether that's religious, whether that's political, whether etc. I mean, that's how things move. We have to be willing to critique those ideas we hold the dearest to ourselves. You know?
Thank you so much. Okay, so without further ado, I think I'm going to end it there. I have a 3-hour Marx class still to come this afternoon, being taught by the amazing Barnaby. Thank you to everybody. Thank you also especially to Barbara, who has been amazing in helping get all the logistics sorted out for today, and also in being strict as a chair when I was unable to be. And yeah, hopefully we'll see you all in 2 weeks' time. I'll let everybody know, still finalizing speakers, but I will let everybody know what the next session is going to be on in due course. And that's a
bye everyone.
Bye.